All right, so does anybody have any questions before we start? Yes, Rachel. Been dying to get a question fired off. After the clawback, next week, I'm going to provide you a detailed grade sheet that's going to show not only your score, but everybody's score in the class of where you stand after the homework. So it'll have homework and the exam in it. So pretty much that'll give you where you stand currently. And then that'll be your midterm grade as well. Okay? Now you got lots of room. Those of you who bombed that test, and there's a few of you out there, you've got lots of time to make up. So buckle down. Don't be too discouraged. There's still hope. Hopefully you did a good clawback. You learned from your mistakes. We're going to keep building on. You've maybe learned a little bit to take things in progression, take things a little bit slower. Don't wait till the very last moment to do your homework. You know, all those things. Maybe start to form some study groups. You know that you need to look at that practice exam, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of points left in the course, so you're not dead in the water. Even if you got a D on this test or an F, you still have time to get up into at least a B, if not an A. I mean, let's face it, an A would be unrealistic. But if you got all perfect scores, or high A scores on the rest of the test, you might even get an A, starting with a D or an F. So, you know, you're not, everything's about points. So a 50 might be a quote-unquote D, and a 49 might be an F, but it's one stinking point out of 400 and whatever we got for the course, right? So everything's about points. So don't get too hung up on the letter grade. Be thinking about points. That's why I wanted to highlight that for you on the clawback, too.
Do you know what day the homework starts?
I think the first one was next Friday. Is that right? Anybody else got that on their schedule? March 8th, yes. So, in fact, all the due dates for the upcoming ones are in there. So if you go into My Econ Lab, put it on your personal calendar of when they're due so you get the reminders. I've made requests to that system to give like auto alerts to students, and for some reason it's beyond their programming capabilities, which I doubt. But anyway. So, anything else? So we left off in the labor market, the first of 4 markets that we're going to build to try to get some insight into the macro economy. And today we'll get into the next chapter, which is the capital market as well, where we have loanable funds. So we just had the structure. Today we need to think about changes to that structure. So what we left off with last time was describing people's behavior, both employers and employees, the labor force, through a supply and demand diagram. We were measuring labor hours on the horizontal axis, the number of hours worked, for the nation, by the way. This is macro class, so this isn't the number of hours worked at Subway this week, right? It's Subway plus everything else in the nation. And over here we were measuring the real wage, which is the nominal wage divided by the price level. So it's a wage that has been adjusted for inflation. It's been deflated by the price level. So that was a technique. We spent quite a bit, most of the hour last time, looking at the effects of the real wage and the importance of it. So households make decisions on how much labor to supply to the market based on the real wage. If they're offered higher pay, they tend to work more, is what the labor supply curve says. Higher wages lead to more hours worked. The labor demand curve on the flip side shows the maximum amount that employers would be willing to pay given the real wage, and it is downward sloping, not because they maybe don't want to pay more, but what was happening that caused employers to have to drop their maximum willingness to pay. Remember, this is the maximum willingness to pay. what was the economic phenomenon that caused that to happen? That the wage that they can afford to pay, the profitable wage that they can afford to pay, falls as more and more hours are being worked. What was that economic concept? One of the top 3 of all economic concepts. Diminishing marginal product. Good. The law of diminishing marginal product. So, because people, as we add more and more hours, the amount of stuff they can make diminishes for each additional person. That was this graph of a production function. If we were measuring real GDP, which again, I'll put up the abbreviation Y, so income, real GDP, be thinking real. Every time you hear the word real, be thinking of purchasing power and the amount of stuff that you can actually buy. If we measure that against labor hours, that relationship is increasing, but at a decreasing rate. So this is the production function. The relationship that shows inputs, output. What I put in, what I get out. From your bucket material, at a fundamental level, it's this graph. Basic resources being squished together to make stuff we want. Here's real GDP right here. The actual quantity of pizza, shirts, and basketballs. That's what we're looking at. What resources does it take to make that stuff? Here's the relationship of how production works. Since additional hours worked when I have a whole bunch of people working already aren't quite as productive as lower hours, and if you're having trouble seeing that, we can take, let's say we've got 100 hours being worked. 100 hours being worked leads to 2,000 units of real GDP, $2,000 worth of junk. 101 hours adds, let's just say, 100 units of junk. So this little area here, graphically, represents the extra junk we get from that 1 hour of extra work. If we compare that now to a level where we have, let's say, 300 hours of work gives me, let's say, 3,000. I'm just kind of making numbers that aren't quite necessarily going to work perfectly with my function, but let's just say it's 3,000. And I look at 1 extra hour of work, 301. The amount of increase I get is much less than 100. Maybe it's 3,040. So I get 40 more units worth of junk here compared to the extra hour here. That's the law of diminishing marginal product. Super important in the results we get in the marketplace. That's what leads to this labor demand curve. It's not because businesses are bad people and they don't want to pay enough money to the people. They are there to run a business, to make some money, and the more people they hire, the less product that comes out, and so naturally they can't pay as much. All right, well, we've got 2 forces at hand. We've got people that are thinking about coming to work, people that want to hire some people. Those 2 groups get together, and we get the equilibrium wage and the amount of hours being worked. All right, that's about where we left last time. Today we're going to look at shifters. How does that change? What causes the real wage to fall? What causes it to go up? Because we know one thing's for sure, it doesn't stay the same, right? If we look over the last 100 years worth of data in the United States, sometimes this goes up, sometimes this goes down. Hopefully it's going up for prosperity purposes. If the real amount of purchasing power that you have today in 2013 is greater than what your grandpa and grandma had in 1955, then there's more stuff per person, right? The real wage rate is higher. So purchasing power has gone up. Well, what are the forces at hand that causes real wage to go up or down and or the number of hours worked to change? Well, what do you think? What would cause, let's think about it in terms of hours rather than maybe in terms of wages. But we could think about it either way. What's changed from 1955 to 2013 that would cause some movement of some things? Population. That's the natural one, right? Population's changed. Now, would population affect the supply curve, the labor supply curve by households, or the labor demand by businesses? Supply, right? So more people means more people working. We work through the logic of here's the population of the United States at 300 million people. About half of those people are in the labor force. Once we kick out the kids and kick out the old people and the people in jail, we're down to about 150 million people. Well, naturally, I don't know what the population was in 1955. I don't know if we got any demographic experts out here, but I'll just take a stab. Maybe I even hate to take a stab here. 220 million. I don't know what it was. So if we were at 220 million, just by people making babies, our population tends to grow, which means that the labor force at that time, let's just say, was approximately divided by 2. Again, I don't know what it was. It might have been a little bit different, but roughly 110. We've got the labor force growing naturally through population growth. Is that going to tend to decrease or increase the real wage if that's the only thing happening? Decrease. So an increase in the supply of labor is a shift to the right of this labor supply curve, which would tend to decrease the labor supply. So let's just go ahead and put LS, let's call this a 1 and this a 2. And maybe this is 2013 and this is 1955. But we start to see what happens. The effects of population growth tends to decrease the real wage, holding all of the things constant. Okay, so we're going to call these shifters. And this is going to be a fairly short list. We could make it a little more complicated, but we're going to, I think the textbook does a nice job of just keeping it simple to population. And so our first shifter we're going to think about, first and only, is going to be changes to the population. Change, which I'll use the symbol with the triangle again, change in population. So an increase in the population leads to an increase in the working age population, probably tend to lead to an increase in the labor force. That is going to be an increase in the labor supply. The notation I'm using here is an increase in labor supply is a shift to the right. It kind of looks like it's shifted down. Technically, that's not wrong. But if we think left and right, then we won't get confused when we get into labor demand. So instead of thinking up, down for now, think kind of left, right. All right. What about on the labor demand side? Labor demand shifters. Again, you got your business cap on. These are the firms. Labor supply is households. Now we've got our business cap on. What would increase my demand for labor? So what would cause me to want to hire more people? What would cause me to want to hire maybe even you over the next Joe that when you guys go out in the job market, what would cause an employer to want to hire you over somebody else? Education, good. And your skills. Education, skills, which hopefully correlate positively to what? Production, productivity, right? So hopefully there's a connection there between a more educated, more highly skilled person is more productive for me, so I'd rather hire that person than somebody else. Now, in general, if we think from the big picture on our island, and we talked about differences between our island and Africa, the average level of education is much higher in the United States compared to Africa. So, on a big scale, the more education, the more skills, the more productive our labor force, the higher the demand for that labor will be, holding all the things constant. So an increase in labor demand, let's call this LD1 and LD2. A labor demand shifter comes to us in productivity. So number one, productivity. I'm going to do this in kind of two phases because that can come about in different ways. So an increase in labor productivity leads to an increase in labor demand, a shift to the right, which is what I just showed on the picture there. Lighting seems a little goofy today. So where did that change in productivity come from? It could come about from a couple places. We've talked about them already with shifts of the production possibilities frontier. So this could come about from, let's call it A, technology. So an increase in technology makes the labor force more productive. Each individual worker can do more things when they have maybe an iPad product as opposed to a typewriter, right? Or a computer. They can be more productive with that type of technology. That technology is embodied in physical capital. So our K, our capital bucket, an increase in physical capital, the machines, the computers, the buildings, that will tend to increase the productivity of labor on the average person. And then lastly, the thing we mentioned with education and skills. Human capital. An increase in education and skills, training, that can make people more productive. We all know that we can give a number of people a computer, and some of those people are going to be able to use it productively, and others are going to say, what does enter mean? Right? If you don't have the skills to go along with that particular piece of capital, you can be very unproductive very quickly. So those three things kind of go hand in hand, all addressing labor productivity. Okay, so this kind of captures, hints at the theories of economic growth that we looked at last time. The classical economists, you have this in your notes already, suspected that the real wage was going to remain constant and low. 200 years ago, Adam Smith time, there was some economists that came after Adam Smith that said, wow, this is kind of a bleak outlook. Population is going to tend to offset any changes in productivity. So you can imagine if this curve shifted to here, we start making babies, we stay at a bad wage. And that's how all of history plays out, right? So for the next 200 years, we're just going to be scraping by because population is always going to be offsetting any technological change. Turned out not to be true, thank goodness. So the Industrial Revolution proved to be pretty awesome with these things going on, all three of these things going on. Technology, accumulation of capital, and education all increased over time and overwhelmed that population effect. So not only did it go from here to here, it probably went up to here. And population continued to grow, but we were always offsetting that with greater and greater increases in productivity, causing the real wage to go up over time. All right, so that's the story of labor and the labor market. Any questions? All right. Next chapter. The next chapter brings about some capital bucket. So we're going to investigate the K bucket a little closer. So in the grand scheme of things, we can look at loanable funds as an indication to how much investment is going on. So over time, I wanted you to visualize an amount of capital at any point in time, and then there was a flow of what that caused the bucket to go up? Investment. So there was investment, which is simply just purchases of new machines and equipment and computers and tools. Purchases of that stuff over the course of the year tend to increase the bucket level. But there's a hole in our bucket, and over time, what's leaking out? Depreciation. So there's different types of depreciation that might be worth noting, since some of you have had some accounting classes. The IRS allows companies to depreciate their computers over a certain time frame. That's different than the type of depreciation we're really talking about here. Here we're talking about economic depreciation, like, is the computer really functioning the way it is? Is it wearing out? Is it as productive as it was in the past? So it's not just an accounting manipulation of numbers. So if a business buys a number of laptops for their sales force and they drop $100 grand into ordering some laptops, the IRS will typically allow that to be depreciated over like a 3-year schedule. Usually, it might even be more aggressive than that. So 3 to 5 year time frame, partially determined by computers become obsolete fairly quickly. Number of factors can come into how the IRS sets that up. But they're going to allow you to deduct let's just say 5 years, $20,000 every year. What's your depreciation this year? $20,000. What's your depreciation next year? $20,000. $20,000, $20,000. Now in reality, that computer might be outdated, outmoded after just 2 years, right? It might have lost its steam, lost its productivity, the company moved on into different directions. So basically, you're ready to just throw that thing in the toilet. It's depreciated on you. Maybe it is truly garbage. It's time to buy a new computer, and those are worthless. You sell them on eBay for $10 and you recapture a little bit of gain. So here, from the nation's perspective, we want to think about stuff wearing out, becoming obsolete, breaking down. All of that stuff is depreciating our productive amount of capital. All right, who's in the loanable funds market then? Who borrows funds on the national scale? Who is our borrowers? Who are our lenders? So we're going to be looking at the loanable funds market. Loanable funds.